Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. So the crew here at This Day has lots of other projects we work on, and it turns out a bunch of them are rolling out right around the same time, right now. So we've been doing, you probably noticed, this little series to highlight it all. We talked about the return of You Get a Podcast, Kelly's Oprah project. We talked about the Obama Oral History project that Nikki works on, the Obituaries podcast that our researcher Jacob Feldman is making. And for the next two episodes, it's my turn. We're going to look at a big new project that I helped steer as editor and producer. It's a documentary series called Death on the Lot. It's hosted by Adam McKay, director of Anchorman and Step Brothers and The Big Short and Don't Look Up, lots of other great things. And it's a series that looks at tragedies in Hollywood in the 40s and 50s and uses those to paint a picture of how the country as a whole was changing in the aftermath of World War II. So you have the rise of TV and the suburban dream, a burgeoning civil rights movement. Of course, there's the Blacklist and HUAC and the Red Scare, which wrapped up lots of people in Hollywood. The series kind of looks at a bunch of folks in the entertainment industry who suffered tragedy. Some names you know, like James Dean and Errol Flynn and John Wayne, and others you may not know but are really fascinating characters like John Garfield and Hattie McDaniel. I'm really proud of this series. It's a really big swing to try and tell a kind of big sweeping story and understand a really consequential era. I also think it's really fun to listen to. It's Adam McKay, after all. There are some absurdist elements. We tried to have fun and make it entertaining. So we're going to talk about Death on the Lot for the next two episodes on this show, and then hopefully you'll go actually listen to the series. Today, we're going to discuss one episode that looks at Hollywood as a union town. We tell the story through a gangster and labor leader, this guy named Willie Byoff, who gets installed basically by the mob as the head of a powerful union in Hollywood and basically corrupts it from within. And at the same time that unions are being corrupted from within, they're being smeared from the outside as full of communists. People are being dragged before the House Un-American Activities Committee. So in this era, you really see how labor is undermined, not just in Hollywood, but throughout the country in ways that we are really dealing with today. So we're going to talk about Hollywood as a union town, Willie Byoff, parallels to today's movie industry labor movements that are happening right now, and a lot more. And here with me are the two writers for Death on the Lot, Steele and Hadley Meares. Brian and Hadley, hello, and I'll say publicly what we've been saying to each other for a while, privately, which is great work. Congratulations, it's done. And also thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you. Congratulations to you.
Congratulations to you.
So as I hinted at, there's this larger story of how unions in Hollywood got corrupted in this era. There's also this specific moment in 1945 that I want to go to where there is a massive and ultimately very bloody strike among some of the major unions. And it went all through the spring and summer of 45 and culminated in the fall as what's known as Black Friday. And Hadley, I wonder if you can start actually with just an image that has really stuck with me from our piece and from this moment, the summer of 45. Outside the Warner Brothers gates. There's these big gates at the entrance of the studio lot, and that's where a lot of the protests and picketing are going on. And there's this scene that you describe of how all these protesters are outside the locked gates, and they're picketing and rabble-rousing and scuffling. And inside the gates, inside the Warner Brothers offices, are like all the studio executives, and they're just like holed up kind of under siege, but they're also kind of like partying and raiding the drink cart and like maybe hooking up with each other or something. It's just this really, really striking, not just image, but I feel like encapsulating snapshot of this whole era. What do you make of that moment?
So the thing that's fascinating is it's such a story of the have and the have-nots, the strike of 45 and the many kind of strikes that are going on throughout the 40s in Hollywood. So you have all of these different laborers who are the backbone of the movie industry outside fighting with goons and thugs that have been hired by the studios, fighting with the LAPD, which was really in the pocket of the studios, and really struggling, people being carted off in ambulances and ending up in the Lincoln County Jail and all of this crazy stuff. And then inside kind of this golden tower of the studios, literally behind castle gates, you have people in this kind of last dance. I'm thinking of the Poe story, like the Mask of the Red Death. Like it's kind of all of the above line workers ensconced in the studio, drinking, partying with starlets, having these wild times because they can't go home until the protesters go home, or they might get injured, or something might happen to them. And I think it just so encapsulates kind of Hollywood in a nutshell of how above line workers have always been treated for the most part, and how below line workers have had to kind of fight and scrap for every little thing that they get as a right, not because the studios wanted to give them to them, but because they fought for those rights.
Brian, you want to jump in here? I mean, you were the lead writer on this episode. You really had to get your head around a lot of the contours of the different unions and the various fractions and all the ways in which the mob was able to infiltrate and corrupt and kind of play all the different sides against each other. Right at this moment, as we've been saying, when unions were really trying to fight for a better system. You want to paint that picture a little bit more about the major players and kind of what's jumped out to you in your research and writing?
The CSU, which was the Conference of Studio Unions, was a kind of ragtag upstart union. IATSE was the dominant union for kind of tradespeople and craftspeople in Hollywood at the time, and it had been infiltrated, which is really what we explore in our episode on Death of the Lot. It had been infiltrated by mob figures and had kind of turned it into a unwitting partner with the studio bosses. And so this was not a union that was necessarily standing up for its members. And so this new union was a much more progressive union, a much smaller union, and it was trying to stand up and take the fight to the studio bosses and get what it deserved. And so they were out there taking fire from all sides. They were being painted as communists at a time when red baiting was a very effective way of shutting down liberalism and leftism in America. And when the Warner Brothers Bacchanal was going on inside the studio, they were really settling in for a long, hot summer of outside the studio gates, which led up to violent clashes of Black Friday when the sides all kind of erupted and went at each other. It was a heady time for labor in Hollywood, and it was also a pivotal turning point for labor in America, which is really what we tried to unpack on our series.
I think that this idea, and I mean, hosting this show that I host where we look at moments from history, so often I feel like one of the lessons that I learn is like all the little interscene battles are just as important as the kind of top line, like A versus B or whatever. And it's like, you have to keep in mind that there's feuds and personalities, and this feels like as much a story about kind of labor being fractured internally as it is labor versus ownership and and the police and all those forces. And it feels especially that case because one of the big themes of this series is that after the war, it was one of these moments where it felt like the entire kind of societal fabric was fracturing and all the chips were kind of out on the table and people were just scrambling and they were fighting against each other and pointing internally and fighting against others and so forth, to just kind of like remake everything. And from a Hollywood perspective, Hadley, like it's very much the case that this is a moment when the studio system is fracturing, right? And it feels much more up for grabs.
Yes, everything was really falling apart for the studios in the post-war era. They had this very tight control on Hollywood really since its inception in the late teens. And you start to see their monopolies being broken up in terms of they can't own theaters anymore. They can't have this kind of monolithic control over the entire industry anymore. You start to see rumblings of TV coming into the picture, scaring people. Radio is bigger than ever. And stars are also starting to finally, even stars in the 30s, Joan Crawford, they'd all say, listen, we're all just factory workers. Like, this is a factory town. Like, my version's more glamorous of it, but I have to be there at 5 a.m. I clock in. If I don't do what the boss man tells me, I get suspended without pay. So there was very much this kind of understanding in the 20s and 30s of that's just how it is. And most of the people who worked in the movie industry were from families who had been kind of cogs in the wheel of industry. They were working class and lots of times even poor folks who would come to the industry, and they were used to working for the man and to kind of doing whatever they had to do to survive. And then after the war, you see so many different groups, union folks, lower class folks, marginalized communities, Black and brown people saying, hey, we just fought in this giant war. We just did all this stuff for this country. We're not going to come back and be treated as the kind of peons we were being treated as before. And another thing that happens is that the country lifts out of the Great Depression because of the war, oddly enough, and the industry it creates. So people weren't quite as desperate for those jobs anymore and weren't willing to take kind of the scraps the studio offered to them, and they wanted something more. So there's so many different things going on that lead to this kind of perfect storm of the union struggles in the 1940s.
And Brian, it seems like, I mean, this is probably the moment where we should walk the main character of this episode, Willie Byoff, onto stage, right? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but do you get the sense in having researched his life and the way that the mob kind of saw opportunity in Hollywood, did the mob sort of see blood in the water in this fracturing and say, oh, here's a chance for us to get in on the game?
So it's a really interesting kind of seismic shift in American culture at the time, where the rising right wing saw a way back to power through attacking labor. At the same time, the mafia had just been picked apart. Basically, the entire leadership of the mafia had been arrested. Al Capone and all of his kind of main lieutenants had been shipped off to jail. At the same time, the prohibition had come to an end and their main moneymaker had been eliminated. And so they were looking for a new business to kind of fund their operation. And around this time, coincidentally, in Chicago, Willie Byoff sort of stumbled into a chance to make money by, instead of having one projectionist in movie theaters, he thought, why not get a second one in there and just collect that money and then take over the projectionist union, and we can have a new cash flow. Well, this was a small beginning to a much larger picture of, why don't we just take over the entire union, take over what basically was IATSE, install our stooges at the top of it, ship them out to LA, and take over as much of the town as possible. So that's what they did. And Willie Byoff was installed as the head of IATSE in Los Angeles. And this was really the dawn, along with a couple other things, the dawn of the mafia moving into labor in America. And that's such a huge shift because, one, it brought a real corrupt element to labor, and two, it was a really easy way to smear labor as corrupt and diminish the power that it already had. So this was really ground zero for a turning point in labor in America. And Willie Byoff, who's the star of our episode, who was just a kind of two-bit stooge, and he was a pimp and just a real, jackass. But he found himself both at the seat of power in Hollywood, but also as one of the people who shepherded in a new era of labor that would slowly be picked apart.
I just love that it starts, though, with a couple projectionists in Chicago. I mean, it's like a real, there's money in the banana stand kind of situation, right?
It's fun. It's fun, too. Something else we didn't get to explore was that the theaters that they initially moved into, and first of all, the theaters refused to play ball, and so they were, throwing smoke bombs into theaters and just terrorizing people to try to get these theaters in Chicago to yield. But the theater chain that they were doing this against was the Balaban Theaters. And I remember when I came across that, I was like, that's an interesting name. Let me check. And Bob Balaban, who's a great actor who you know from Seinfeld and all the Christopher Guest movies, among many other things, it was his grandfather and brothers who ran the Balaban Theaters. So that's a little fun tie to current Hollywood, too.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting the world together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
So Hadley, I mean, you're the one who keeps your eye on the kind of big sweep of Hollywood history. I mean, how much is the mafia element, a force in the kind of history of Hollywood as an industry?
I think there's periods throughout Hollywood history when the mafia's involvement kind of goes in and out. I think that even more so, a lot of the times than direct mafia involvement was the studios kind of creating their own little mafias. So you'll see a lot of studios have fixers like Eddie Mannix and a lot of those guys who basically did everything a mafioso would, right? They ran through fear and intimidation and threats, but they did it under the payroll of the studio system. So I think that they learned a lot of lessons from the mafia and its structure. And I mean, hey, a lot of those early studio moguls had been raised in the exact same neighborhoods in New York and the outer boroughs of New York as those mafia guys. In fact, some of them were friends with some of them growing up. So they were kind of from the same generation, the same family, the same immigrant class of folks. So the way they operated was very, very similar in a lot of ways.
I guess it's easier to corrupt an industry that's already kind of willing to corrupt itself.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Brian, tell us a little bit more about this guy, Willie Byoff. I mean, we have a whole episode about his exploits, but kind of like, how does he get his claws into the Hollywood system and start to really corrupt the unions?
Well, he started off as just a hoodlum on the streets of Chicago and caught the eye of this decimated mafia through this scheme with the projectionist union. But once he's installed out in Hollywood, he found himself to be all of a sudden a real power player. And this is a guy who he had, which later played a part in his undoing. He had a huge estate out in the valley with, $1,000 trees that he was planting. He was famous for his fast life, women around him, fancy cars, and for hobnobbing with all the studio bosses. So he really lived the life once he was out in Hollywood, but he also played pretty fast and loose, and the bosses back in Chicago got pretty concerned because he started prioritizing kind of his own extravagant life over protecting the family, and that would come back to bite him in the butt in a big way. And eventually that led to his death, which was where we start the episode with an explosion on a quiet suburban street and the end of Willie Byoff.
So we'll let people listen and get a sense of kind of his demise, but also all the various schemes he got into. But in a larger sense, for both of you, I think we try in this episode to, and I think it's true, that like labor genuinely was corrupt. It was corrupted by mafia influence, but also corrupt, right? And I think we're honest about that. But it was also painted as corrupt from the outside, as you hinted, Brian. And then moreover, it's this kind of twin painting of labor in this moment, which is one, the leadership is corrupt and mobbed up. And then the rank and file, individual members, well, they're communists and they were red baited. I think that a lot of people know the story of, HUAC and the blacklist, and we get into a lot of that stuff. But maybe people don't realize how much it was tied into labor, and the labor element was really a big part of the reason that folks were painted as communist in this moment.
Well, here's an easy way to kind of chart how this allowed the right wing to kind of exploit it for power, and that's the story of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan,
labor leader,
was an FDR Democrat and a middling movie star
at best.
Who during this labor action, he used it to climb the ranks of SAG, his union, but also then claimed that he was being targeted by union members and abused and harassed. He was crossing the picket line, and it was the beginning of his sharp turn from an FDR liberal into a arch conservative. He really resented this labor action, and that led directly into, as you just said, him then solidifying into an anti-Red Baiter and the HUAC hearings, and then him going and testifying in front of HUAC. So this really is the start of not just a sharp pivot away from kind of the power of labor, but really the blueprint for how to destroy labor and liberalism in America. And Ronald Reagan is the perfect example of that. And then he went on to build the rest of his career basically on the backs of this strike and HUAC, which we also cover in the series. Those were the birth pangs of his right-wing career.
You know, the studio's heads found a perfect way to get people against the unions by saying they're filled with communists, because they get the beginning of the Red Scare when everyone's being indoctrinated into all the fears about communism after the Nazis have been defeated. And it's such a useful tool, not just for Hollywood, but for every big industry, to be able to pin communism labels on those people who are trying to fight against them. You know, it's kind of a great way to use a current event and a topic that's like a hot button topic right now to your own ends, so that you somehow look like a real clean American. And these, you know, workers who the public would naturally probably gut level, they'd actually side with the workers, right? So you've got to find a way to paint them as something scary or nefarious, since they already have the advantage of really having the upper hand in terms of public opinion, because they are fighting. It's the little guy fighting against the big guy.
Yeah. And I mean, when you talk about doing the work of history and finding parallels for now, which I think we should talk about that on a number of fronts, but, you know, certainly political expediency around the kind of wedge issue of the moment is a through line in American history. And we see it now with certain catchphrases and moral panics. And we certainly saw it there with anti-communism being a way to retrofit lots of other things that people in power wanted to do. And, you know, we've name-checked Ronald Reagan, but I mean, in this episode, I think you also see, like, this was a moment where Walt Disney was radicalized or you know, conservatized. This is a moment when Howard Hughes, who had other things going on in his brain, but this is a moment when he becomes virulently anti-communist and anti-labor. So you see a lot of people in power being expedient in that way. As we wrap up, I mean, obviously, we started doing this episode before there was a writer's strike. It is coming out now in the midst of a writer's strike. Brian and Hadley, you've both been out there in LA on the picket lines. I've gone out on the lines here to offer my support. How much are you thinking about 1945 and about this story as you're out there in 2023 in a labor action?
You know, it's interesting because I think one of the real lessons is that Hollywood, or the movie and television industry, it's a labor industry. It's a labor town. And we have now 100 years of real history of labor helping to shape what the industry is. And the industry has always been inequitable in a certain sense and far from fair, but it over time carved out certain norms and certain abilities for people within the industry to make a decent living, to live a middle-class life and have a career. And I think one of the striking things about now is that even some of these labor disputes we're talking about here, which were really ugly, and the sides painted each other with really broad brushes and ugly refrains, that now we are under attack from these outside forces, which is it was first kind of major corporations, but now these big tech companies. And what's so different is that all this labor action for 100 years was against these studios that had a long history of participating in them. They may have hated it, but they participated in it. Now we're facing off against Amazon and Apple. These are companies that disdain labor, have no track record with labor, won't even come to the table and talk to labor. And so it's a really unique time. And then obviously there's technological changes that threaten to blow up this whole industry, but also more broadly, this is a continuation of the mechanization of factories, and piece by piece over the last 30 years, changing the world so that technology is taking away jobs. And so that's a huge part of this too. But it's really interesting because, this town was built by labor, and labor is trying to fight, I guess, now for its last best chance to protect jobs for people within it. So it's been really inspiring, and obviously touching back on these previous labor actions, it's seeing what they gained from it and the industry they built, and hopefully fighting to protect it for another generation now.
Hadley, you want to jump in on any of that?
Oh, I'm just going to do my usual everything's horrible take.
Okay.
I think what has struck me so much during this latest strike is what simple things the writers are asking for that seem like they should be no-brainers. And a lot of times they're actually just asking for things that they used to have that they don't have anymore, because these giants like Amazon and Netflix have disrupted everything so much. And, as a person who used to work in the industry, and I was a stand-in, and I'd see like the way extras were treated, even though they were in the union, and it was appalling. And, there'd be union reps on set. And so I guess everything was fine the way they were treating these extras, because like technically it was legal under these things that SAG had supposedly fought so hard to get these extras. But it still seemed to me like disgusting, brutal, rude labor. So I think that it can't be overstated that whenever a union, and that's the WGA today, but whenever a union is fighting for rights and the studios try and paint them as extravagant or out of this world, they're really usually rights that are totally common sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I feel like, studying history often teaches us that, right? You look back at something even 5-10 years later and you're like, they were fighting over that? That seems pretty reasonable, but in the moment, obviously things get distorted and weaponized and so forth. I'll just add two things. One is, Brian, your point about technological disruption now, we should point out that, in many ways, that's the story of what happens after the war, because the series that we work on, if people listen, I think you'll see that one of the big through lines is obviously the demise of the studio system, but the rise of television, right? And television is this big destabilizing force in the entertainment industry writ large. And then from there, you have all this fallout into all these different ways and all these different worlds and on the backs of all these people. So that, that's a through line for sure, is technological disruption destabilizes and leads to all sorts of unrest. And then the other thing I'll add is just another little tidbit, but I want people to actually listen and hear all the tidbits. The one tidbit that's been rattling around in my head, particularly with regards to the strike itself, is this tactic that was used in the 40s during this strike by picketers, where they would stand outside of movie theaters, and in order to undermine the movie industry, they would yell the end of a movie at people who were walking in to go see what the movie was, like a real life spoiler alert. And I've been heartened to find out that there's been some people with the signs, on the picket lines, on the WGA picket lines, basically saying things like, if you don't negotiate, we're going to spoil the end of Succession or whatever. But I love that tactic. And it shows also that, as vital and critical and hard-nosed as all these negotiations are, labor action should have a spirit of a little zest to it as well. And I'm seeing that in this action as well.
Without a doubt. Yeah.
All right. Well, Like I said, there's a lot more in this story, particularly around this character, Willie Byoff, and all that he got up to and the way that he interacted with Hollywood history. So we will go let people listen to that episode, which is the second episode of Death on the Law. It is out now for everyone to listen to. Hadley and Brian will be back for one more episode where we'll talk about another thing we covered in the series. But for now, I say to both of you, Brian Steele, Hadley Meares, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jody.
Radiotopia.